On the night of May 12, 1862, a steamboat called the Planter sat docked at a Confederate wharf in Charleston, South Carolina. The Planter was not an ordinary vessel. It was a military dispatch boat, 147 feet long, armed with a howitzer and a cannon, used by Confederate forces to move supplies, ammunition, and officers between the fortified islands protecting Charleston Harbor. It was, in practical terms, one of the most important ships in the Confederate coastal defense system. The officers who commanded it slept that night in their quarters on shore, as they often did, leaving the ship in the care of its enslaved crew. The man they left in charge was named Robert Smalls. He was 23 years old. He had been born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839. He had been hired out to work in Charleston as a child, which was a common arrangement, enslavers renting out enslaved people to businesses and households in exchange for wages that went entirely to the owner. Smalls had worked on the Charleston waterfront for years. He had learned to navigate the harbor. He had learned the signal codes the Confederate forts used to identify friendly vessels. He had learned the schedules, the rotations, the specific sequences of flag and whistle that meant a ship was authorized to pass. He had been learning all of this deliberately for months. At approximately 3 a.m. on May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls put on the captain's uniform and the wide-brimmed straw hat that the Planter's white captain habitually wore. He stood at the helm in the darkness. The silhouette, a man at the wheel, the right hat, the right posture, was what the Confederate sentries expected to see. He gave the order to cast off. What happened in the next 4 hours is in the Union Navy's official records, in the congressional testimony that followed, and in the Charleston newspapers that reported the theft of a Confederate military vessel with a combination of rage and disbelief. Smalls navigated the Planter through Charleston Harbor, past Fort Sumter, past the Confederate gun batteries that could have reduced the ship to splinters with a single broadside. He stopped once, at a prearranged location, to take on board his wife Hannah, their 2 children, and 9 other enslaved people who had been waiting in a small boat in the darkness. At each Confederate checkpoint, he gave the correct signal, the straw hat, the correct whistle sequence, the correct flag. The sentries passed him through. When he crossed into Union Navy waters, he lowered the Confederate flag and raised a white bedsheet. The Union blockade ships nearly fired on him anyway. A Confederate vessel approaching at speed was not by default a welcome sight. He kept coming. He kept the white sheet visible. The Union sailors held their fire. Robert Smalls delivered the Planter, its howitzer, its cannon, its ammunition, its codebooks, and its charts of Confederate minefields in Charleston Harbor to the United States Navy at approximately 5 a.m. on May 13, 1862. The codebooks and the minefield charts alone were worth more to the Union war effort than the ship itself. The Confederates had to change their entire harbor defense signaling system because one man had memorized it and walked out with the documentation. Now I want to stay with that night for a moment longer, because the logistics of what Smalls did require you to understand something about what it took to plan it. He had no margin. Every element had to work. The officers had to stay on shore. They didn't always. The timing had to be precise. The harbor had specific windows when the tide and the patrol rotations aligned. The families waiting in the small boat had to stay silent and invisible in the dark for hours. The Confederate sentries at each checkpoint had to see exactly what they expected to see and nothing more. One wrong signal, one sentry who looked too closely, one child who made a sound at the wrong moment. Any of it would have meant death, not capture, not imprisonment, but death, because what Smalls was doing was not just escape, it was theft of a military vessel in wartime. The Confederacy did not have a legal process for that. He had planned it for months. He had told almost no one. The people who were coming with him found out only days before. He made that choice deliberately. The fewer people who knew, the smaller the chance that someone, under pressure or fear, would say something to someone who would say something to the wrong person. The man the Confederate officers left in charge of their military vessel while they slept on shore had spent months building the knowledge, the timing, and the nerve to take everything they had and hand it to their enemies. And they had not seen it. They had looked at Robert Smalls every day for months and had not seen what he was doing. because they had decided, before they ever looked, what kind of man he was. The Union response was immediate. Smalls was brought before Admiral Samuel DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. DuPont wrote to the Secretary of the Navy the same day. His letters in the National Archives, he described the intelligence value of what Smalls had delivered, the codebooks, the charts, the vessel itself, and recommended that Smalls and his crew receive the monetary reward that Union law provided for the capture of Confederate ships. Congress agreed. Smalls received $1,500, his share of the prize money for delivering the planner to the Union Navy. It was the largest sum of money that had ever legally belonged to him. He had been born into a system specifically designed to ensure that no sum of money would ever legally belong to him. Within weeks, his story was in northern newspapers. He was invited to Washington. He met Abraham Lincoln. He met Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He argued in those meetings for something that the Union had not yet decided to do: arm black soldiers. The Union Army had been fighting the war for over a year without formally enlisting black men. Smalls told Stanton directly that there were enslaved men across the South who would fight if given the chance. He was not the only person making this argument, but he was making it with a credibility that was difficult to dismiss. He had just delivered a Confederate warship to prove what an enslaved man was capable of when given the means and the moment. The 1st South Carolina Volunteers, one of the first official black Union regiments, began formal organization within months of Smalls's meetings in Washington. The connection between his advocacy and that decision is not documented in a single memo, but the timing is in the record, and the men who made the decision knew who Robert Smalls was. He continued working for the Union Navy for the rest of the war. He piloted the Planter, his ship now, sailing under the Union flag, on 17 military engagements. He was under fire. He was cited for bravery. In December 1863, during an engagement near Folly Island, the Planter came under heavy Confederate fire, and the white captain, the Union officer in command, left the wheelhouse and hid below deck. Smalls took the helm. He navigated the ship out of the engagement. The incident is in the official Navy report. The captain was relieved of command. Smalls was formally recognized. He was 24 years old. In 1863, the Union Army occupied Beaufort, South Carolina, the town where Robert Smalls had been born into slavery. The man who had owned him, Henry McKee, had fled when the Union forces arrived, as most white Southern landowners did. The property, including the house where Smalls had been born, where his mother had been enslaved, was seized by the federal government for unpaid taxes under the laws governing Confederate-held territory. Robert Smalls bought it. He paid $650 for the house where he had been born a slave. He moved his family in. He moved his mother in. The woman who had raised him in bondage in that house lived out the rest of her life in it as a free woman in a house that her son owned. Henry McKee's wife later came to the door, destitute, after the war ended. She had nowhere to go. Robert Smalls let her live in the house. He took care of her until she died. That is not in most history books. It is in the records of Beaufort County and in the accounts of people who were there. A man born into slavery in a house bought that house, and then took care of the wife of the man who had owned him, because he had decided that was the kind of man he was. The war ended in 1865. Reconstruction began. And Robert Smalls, who had delivered a Confederate warship to the Union Navy, who had advocated for black soldiers, who had piloted 17 military engagements, who had bought the house where he was born, Robert Smalls ran for Congress. He won. He represented South Carolina's 5th Congressional District starting in 1875. He served 5 terms over the next decade. He fought for public education in South Carolina. The state's first free public school system was established during the Reconstruction period when black legislators held power, and Smalls was among the men who built it. He fought against the systematic disenfranchisement that was already beginning as federal troops withdrew from the South. He could see what was coming. He said so on the floor of Congress. The record is there. What came next is the second half of this story, and it requires understanding something about the specific mechanism by which everything Robert Smalls had built and everything the people who voted for him had built was taken apart piece by piece with the full knowledge and eventual approval of the United States government. The documents were always there. What was missing was someone willing to read them. In 1876, Robert Smalls was running for re-election to Congress. He had served 2 terms. He had helped build South Carolina's public school system from nothing. He had fought on the floor of the House of Representatives against the systematic rollback of black voting rights that was already accelerating as federal troops withdrew from the South. He had done all of this as a man who had been born into slavery in the same state he was now representing in the United States Congress. On the night of September 16, 1876, Smalls was scheduled to speak at a political rally in Ellenton, South Carolina. He never made it. A white paramilitary group called the Red Shirts intercepted him on the road. The Red Shirts were not a fringe organization. They were the armed enforcement wing of the South Carolina Democratic Party, organized, funded, and directed by men whose names appear in state and federal records. Their method was specific and documented. They attended Republican rallies in force, armed, and demanded equal time to speak. When black candidates refused or when crowds resisted, the violence began. Between August and November of 1876, the Red Shirts killed an estimated 100 black men in South Carolina. The number is in federal congressional testimony. It is not an estimate from hostile sources. It comes from the investigation the United States Congress conducted after the election. Smalls was not killed that night. He was surrounded, threatened, and forced to turn back. The rally did not happen. He won the election anyway. What happened next is the part of this story that requires the congressional record to fully understand, because what happened next was not random violence or local politics. It was a coordinated national decision made in Washington, D.C., by men in suits, in rooms, using the machinery of democratic government to dismantle what democratic government had built. In November 1876, the United States held a presidential election. The Republican candidate was Rutherford Hayes. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden. The result was disputed. 3 southern states, including South Carolina, submitted competing sets of electoral votes. The election went to a special congressional commission. The commission's deliberations lasted through the winter of 1876 and into February 1877. What emerged from those deliberations was not recorded in a single document. It was a series of conversations, agreements, and understandings between Republican and Democratic Party operatives that historians have reconstructed from correspondence, memoirs, and the subsequent actions of the parties involved. The arrangement is known as the Compromise of 1877. Its terms were straightforward. Hayes would become president. In exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the remaining southern states where they were still protecting black voters and black office holders. Reconstruction was over. The federal government would look away. The last federal troops left South Carolina on April 10, 1877. Robert Smalls watched them go. He was still in Congress. He was still the elected representative of South Carolina's 5th Congressional District. The federal government had just negotiated away the military protection that made his constituents' votes meaningful in a private arrangement between party operatives in exchange for a presidential election. It is in the record. The correspondence is in university archives, the subsequent actions, the immediate acceleration of disenfranchisement, the violence that followed the troop withdrawal, the speed with which black office holders were removed across the South, are in the congressional testimony of the men who watched it happen and tried to stop it. Smalls tried to stop it. He stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and described what was happening in South Carolina. He named names. He cited specific incidents. The congressional record contains his speeches. They are precise, documented, and almost entirely ignored by the history taught in American schools. In 1878, South Carolina Democrats brought criminal charges against Robert Smalls. The charge was bribery. He was accused of accepting a bribe during his time in the state legislature in the early 1870s. The evidence was thin. The timing was not. The prosecution came directly after the federal troop withdrawal, in the same months that Democratic officials were systematically removing black office holders across the state through a combination of legal pressure, electoral fraud, and the credible threat of violence. Smalls was convicted. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He never served a day. The reason he never served a day is itself a document that almost nobody has read. The federal government, the same federal government that had just withdrawn its troops from South Carolina, intervened, not out of conscience, out of a specific political calculation. South Carolina Democrats were simultaneously prosecuting a group of white Republican election officials on charges related to the 1876 election. The Republican-controlled federal government agreed to drop those prosecutions. South Carolina agreed to pardon Robert Smalls. The two corrupt prosecutions canceled each other out. Smalls walked free as part of a deal that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the political convenience of the men making it. The pardon documents are in the South Carolina State Archives. The correspondence connecting the two prosecutions is in federal records. The deal is reconstructible from the documents. It is simply not taught. Smalls returned to Congress. He served additional terms through the early 1880s. And through those years, he watched the systematic dismantling of everything Reconstruction had built, not through a single dramatic act, but through the slow accumulation of laws, court decisions, and acts of violence that the federal government declined to prevent. The public school system he had helped build in South Carolina was defunded. The black voters who had elected him were removed from the rolls through literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, legal mechanisms specifically designed to disenfranchise black citizens while technically applying to everyone. The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions in the 1870s and 1880s, systematically narrowed the application of the 14th and 15th Amendments that had been passed to protect black citizenship. The federal government had the constitutional authority to intervene. It chose not to. Consider what that looked like for one specific man. His name was January Pinckney. He was a farmer in Beaufort County. He had voted in every election since emancipation. In 1878, he walked to his polling place as he always had. A group of red shirts was waiting at the entrance. They told him the polling place had moved. They gave him a different address. He walked there. There was no polling place. By the time he walked back, the polls had closed. His vote, the vote of a man who had earned it, who had exercised it for a decade, who had sent Robert Smalls to Washington with it, did not exist that day. His name is in the Congressional testimony of 1878. He is one of dozens documented in that single county in that single election. In 1886, Robert Smalls lost his congressional seat. The district had been gerrymandered. The voter rolls had been purged. The men who voted for him had been systematically prevented from voting. He contested the result. The congressional committee that reviewed the contest found evidence of fraud. They found it and did nothing. He was 47 years old. He had piloted a Confederate warship out of Charleston Harbor at the age of 23. He had served in Congress for 5 terms. He had bought the house where he was born a slave. He had watched the federal government build something and then negotiated away in a private room in Washington while he was still serving in the legislature that room contained. He went home to Beaufort. Here is what he did there. He was appointed customs collector for the port of Beaufort, a federal position, one of the few patronage appointments that black Republicans could still hold in the South in the 1880s and 1890s. He held it for years, through Democratic and Republican administrations that alternately protected and threatened the appointment. He stayed in the house he had bought. He remained a presence in Beaufort County politics for the rest of his life. He did not disappear. In 1895, South Carolina held a constitutional convention specifically to write black citizens out of the political process permanently. New literacy tests, new property requirements, new provisions designed to be neutral on their face and eliminatory in practice. The convention was entirely Democratic. Not a single black delegate was seated. It produced a constitution that would govern South Carolina for decades. Robert Smalls was one of the 6 black men who appeared before that convention to protest what was being done. He was 56 years old. He stood in front of the men who were writing him and everyone who looked like him out of the political system he had spent his life participating in. And he spoke. His speech is in the record of the convention. It runs to several pages. He described what black South Carolinians had built during Reconstruction. He described the public schools. He described the infrastructure. He described what had been taken and how. He said directly, in language that the convention record preserves exactly, that what was being done was not democracy. That it was the destruction of democracy by men who had lost a war and were now winning the peace through methods that the battlefield had not permitted them. The convention ignored him. The Constitution passed. South Carolina's black voters were effectively removed from the political process for the next 70 years until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Robert Smalls lived until 1915. He died in Beaufort in the house he had bought from the estate of the man who had owned him at the age of 75. His obituary appeared in South Carolina newspapers. It described his Civil War service. It described his congressional career. It did not describe the Constitutional Convention speech. It did not describe what had been systematically dismantled around him over the last 4 decades of his life. The house in Beaufort still stands. It is a National Historic Landmark. You can visit it. The speech at the 1895 Constitutional Convention is in the South Carolina State Archive. The congressional record of his speeches on the House floor is in the Library of Congress. The Navy report describing the moment the white captain hid below deck and Smalls took the wheel is in the National Archives. The pardon documents are in Columbia. The red shirt's violence is in the congressional testimony of 1876. Every document exists. Every name is in the record. The man who piloted a Confederate warship out of Charleston Harbor at 23 years old died at 75 in the house where he was born a slave, having watched the government he served negotiate away everything he had helped build, piece by piece, in private rooms using the machinery of democracy to dismantle democracy while he was still standing in it. He saw it coming. He said so. The record kept his words. Almost nobody taught them. He taught. The planter, the Confederate warship Robert Smalls delivered to the Union Navy on May 13, 1862, was decommissioned after the war. It was sold to a private shipping company. It continued operating as a cargo vessel along the South Carolina coast for years. In 1876, the same year the red shirts were blocking Smalls' rallies and the Compromise of 1877 was being negotiated in Washington, the planter ran aground in a storm off Cape Romaine, South Carolina, and sank. The ship that Robert Smalls had used to free himself, his family, and 12 other people, the ship whose codebooks had forced the Confederacy to change its entire harbor defense system, sank 14 years later within sight of the coast where the story began. The wreck has never been located. The house in Beaufort is still there. The archive in Columbia still has his speech. The National Archives still has the Navy report. The Library of Congress still has his words from the floor of the House. He put everything in the record because he knew someone would eventually read it. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.